would often be highlighted. Thus, Habsburg reform proceeded not only much more rapidly, but also set forces into motion whose interaction constantly tended to expand the areas of human activity that it saw in need of reform. By the 1780s, the Habsburg monarchy had become the locus of the boldest and most ambitious innovations in Europe. So these are the general dynamics that I mentioned. It's within the context of these broader developments that I now want to examine some of the conflicting notions that lay behind the specific reform policies adopted. I have used the terms Cameralism, Josephism, and Enlightenment as the organizing framework, and I have put them in that order in the title because, in a sense, that's how they make their chronological appearance in the history of Austria, or the Habsburg monarchy. But I'm going to look at them the other way around, because the term Enlightenment will be a term quite familiar to most people. And matters, unfortunately, when we talk about the Enlightenment, have nowadays become much more complicated over the past generation, because there's an increasing tendency among scholars to see the European Enlightenment as a broad spectrum of regional and ideological variants that even includes the notion of a religious enlightenment. When we speak of an Enlightenment party in the case of the Austrian Empire, of the Habsburg Empire, or Habsburg monarchy, we generally do not refer to it in this broad way. Rather, we refer to the specific devotees of the mature Western and especially French Enlightenment. So we're talking about the old traditional secular Western Enlightenment when we talk about Enlightenment in Austria. Cameralism may be a term less familiar than Enlightenment, but has become a staple of early modern historians, particularly after the seminal work of Mark Raeff and the rejoinder by Andre Wakefield that have become quite famous. Conceived as a science of administration by a number of 17th century political economists, it generally posited policy recommendations to improve the productivity and moral well-being of society. And finally, Josephism. Josephism is a term very specific to the Habsburg monarchy, the meaning and origin of which had long been the objects of one of the most savage controversies in Central European historiography. The term Josephism was initially coined in the 19th century to describe the reform program implemented in the Habsburg monarchy during the reign of Emperor Joseph II, who ruled from 1780 to 1790. But it came increasingly to apply specifically to the measures undertaken against the social, economic, political, and cultural position of the Catholic Church within the Habsburg monarchy. The main outlines of the discussion were first charted over 70 years ago in discussions stimulated by the Nazi-tainted cultural historian Fritz Waljawitz and Edward Winter, whose colorful career, by the way, saw him evolve from a seminarian through a Nazi to a Marxist, which subsequently prompted a response, a very famous response by the Jesuit scholar Ferdinand Maas, and led to a very large and fruitful literature. From the start, definitions have ranged across a broad spectrum, of which those of Waljawitz and Maas could be seen as the opposite poles. Waljawitz tended to see Josephism as a sort of general ideology of reform within a broad political and ideological agenda, and that it was no coincidence that the title of an earlier version of this slender volume on Josephism was entitled Josephism as a Political and Ideological Movement. This rather vague notion was shared by such authors as the American Paul Bernard, who saw it as a rather, quote, diffuse ideology consisting of many different viewpoints. In other words, we don't know what it is. And indeed, recently, Joseph II's principal biographer, my colleague Derek Beals in Cambridge, has similarly suggested that Josephism was, quote, merely the Austrian monarchy's version of the Enlightenment. The problem with such an approach, as the Austrian historian Erich Zöllner has noted, is that it tends to undermine the central nature of the church-state question in the controversy. Maas, on the other hand, famously interpreted very narrowly as state control over the ecclesiastical sphere. or that is to say, Austrian Erastianism, the German word Staatskirchentum, state churchism. Although in his major work he initially saw the Habsburg state chancellor, Prince Wenzel Anton, Václav Antonín Kaunitz, or I should say, Wenzel Anton Kaunitz, Václav Antonín Kaunitz,